Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon.
We are joined once again by the brilliant, esteemed, incredibly intelligent Jonathan North. How are you, sir?
Nice to see you again, John. Very well. Hope you're okay.
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. For those of you not familiar with Jonathan, he's a great historian and author. He's written a number of books, including one called Killing Napoleon, that I highly recommend my audience check out. You can find it on Amazon. And we're going to talk about the various assassination attempts on Napoleon today. Which one does Killing Napoleon kind of focus on?
So we are venturing into the world of cloak and daggers today, John. The book itself is mostly on the subject of the infernal machine. That's the cart bomb that attempted to blow up Napoleon on Christmas Eve at 1800 and destroyed a street in Paris. So that's the focus of the book. But around that time, you have many other schemes and plots going on. So it kind of pulls in a number of different strands. There are several attempts on Napoleon and several plots ongoing to deal with Napoleon as and around the time he becomes first consul.
Yeah, and we'll dive into it here in just a minute. But you have to remember the French Revolution and Napoleon are a threat to all these established houses around Europe, right? They don't want this revolution idea taking fire across Europe. They want to squelch it in its early stages, right?
Yeah. So I think you've got two strands. You've got the established houses, royal houses of Europe, the Bourbons of France, who don't take kindly to Napoleon declaring himself dictator and taking charge. But you've also got a lot of disappointed revolutionaries, former Jacobins, former radicals, who looked at Napoleon's seizure of power and thought that was a step too far. They weren't particularly organized in 1800, not to the same extent that the royalists, but they're still seen as, by those around Napoleon, they're still seen as a potential threat. And I have to say that the idea of assassination wasn't particularly unusual in that time. So in 1792, the King of Sweden, Gustav III, had been shot and killed. And in 1801, the Tsar of Russia, Paul, would be murdered by some of the aristocrats around him. So it's not as though Napoleon was unique in being targeted this way. It's just that that's something that was obviously one way of dealing with somebody in power.
Yeah. The author Philip Dwyer estimates that 20 to 30 attempts were made on his life during his reign that we know of. What do you think the actual number is?
So I think it's incredibly difficult to determine how many actual plots were acted upon. So 20 to 30 to me seems a little high, because often what we get are little snippets in unreliable memoirs by Bourrienne or Constant, the valet, hinting at something, or something by Fouché, who reports to Napoleon that you've got to be careful because so-and-so is plotting against you. So how many were actually translated into firm, solid plots against Napoleon? I think it's a bit less than that, but still there's a lot of talk about these things.
Right.
And there are a lot of plans and schemes being considered. Whether they actually turn into action is a different thing. But yeah, around 1800, with Napoleon as first consul, you do get a sudden flurry of activity to pull him off this throne he's kind of mounted.
Okay. Well, we're going to talk about the ones that actually went into motion. But before we get there, I mean, we talked kind of about the why, but who were some of the people kind of behind it? Was it the British? Was it the exiled Bourbons? Was it the Jacobins? Who was funding these attempts?
So I think the primary agents behind attempts on Napoleon's life have to be the royalists. So that's the Bourbon in exile. Not so much the king, but there's someone called the Comte d'Artois, who is a very serious zealot, very indignant that Louis XVI had been guillotined, and a man who would stop at nothing. He was very radical in his royalism. And he had a lot of connections in Britain, and he had a lot of connections from the west of France, the regions of France that had fought the revolution, La Vendée, Brittany, Normandy, and a lot of captains, royalist captains there who were sympathetic to the Bourbon cause, and again, prepared to do dirty work if it meant that the king could return. Now, a lot of these people received salaries and pensions from the British government, so there is a British connection. But I don't think that the British were that keen on getting their hands dirty, not their own hands. But I think they wouldn't have minded so much if Napoleon had been ambushed, had been assassinated. They just would have denied any knowledge or involvement. So it's a kind of difficult one to pin down. I know a lot of people, when they read about assassinations, attempts on Napoleon, would really, really like to see the secret hand of Britain pulling all the strings. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. So
yeah, it's interesting to me that he was generally referred to as the usurper of the Bourbon House of France, but he had nothing to do with the French Revolution. He was just a soldier in the army at that time. So it's interesting that they kind of pin that on him. I guess he was a product of the revolution, so that's what they're saying, that he grabbed the throne. Yeah.
Exactly that. And there was an idea early on that Napoleon, when he became consul, would then reach out to Louis and say, now you can come back. And it does seem quite far-fetched, but there was a genuine idea that he might do that. And that's something that had happened during the British Revolution in the 1650s. General Monk had brought back Charles II. So it wasn't out of this world that might happen. But then it became very clear that Napoleon was not going to hand over power to anybody. And it's at that point where really when they start thinking, well, if he's going to be like that, then what we can do is we can assassinate him and we can organize a coup of our own in Paris and we'll get the king to come back. So there's all that activity. Then on the other side, like you say, you've got the Jacobins, the revolutionaries, who are very disappointed that Napoleon would overturn the Republic and create his own administration and seize power for himself. So they're very bitter, but they're not as organized. They're not really cohesive, but they still become the target of animosity just because they're very vocal and difficult people. So in a way, an opportunity is created to blacken their name and get rid of them. And we see that in a number of plots around 1800, that they get blamed for things, that their leaders get sent into exile. I mean, there's a great case, which we won't get into, but it's in the book, of a Jacobin general who gets sent to a desert island in the Seychelles because it's alleged that he's involved in a plot against Napoleon. Yeah. So there's a lot of activity around that, and Napoleon sensed that he might be in some danger from these radicals.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into a few of these attempts. The first one is kind of impromptu and may not have even happened, but according to Napoleon, it's during his 1799 coup and the 18 Brumaire incident, where Napoleon goes in and claims that liberty is in danger, that he has to take over his first council, and he claims that the legislators drew daggers on him during this attempt. Is this true?
Certainly, that's alleged to be the case. So the whole episode of Napoleon going in there and clearing out the deputies is shrouded in some mystery and disagreement. It was a little bit more clumsy than the legend and the myth made it out to be. But what seems to have happened is, I don't think daggers were drawn. Lucien Bonaparte says that they were drawn, but it does seem that Napoleon was attacked by a deputy called Destrem, who tried to punch him, and another Corsican called Arena, who pulled his collar and hurt one of the grenadiers guarding Napoleon. So there was physical abuse, but I don't actually see any evidence of daggers being used. So perhaps we could leave it in that kind of vague.
Maybe a half of an attempt. Yeah, half. Yeah,
maybe a dagger was drawn, but it wasn't used.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, after Napoleon becomes first consul, Malmaison becomes the site of several alleged assassination plots. And according to Napoleon's valet, Constant, who you mentioned earlier, this included a poisoning attempt. Quote, sundry alterations and repairs had to be made in the chimney piece of the first consul's apartments at La Malmaison. The person superintending this work sent certain stonecutters, some of whom were in league with the conspirators, and just as the first consul was about to take up his residence in the newly prepared apartments, upon a desk at which he sat a snuff box was found, precisely similar to the one which he had the habit of using. At first, they supposed that it actually belonged to him, but that it had been in fact left there by his valet de chambre. The suspicions aroused by the strange appearance of some of the workmen took deeper root. The snuff was taken out and analyzed, and it was indeed poisoned, end quote. That's a long quote, but was there a poisoning attempt there?
Yeah, I think that that's a sort of classic sort of example of the kind of plots that we're hearing about a bit. But it's again one of those that comes from his valet. It doesn't say who was behind it, who the plotters were. It doesn't really give any hints as to the motivation, but it's plausible. Somebody could well have poisoned Napoleon's snuff. Napoleon was a great snuff taker. And around that time, you get other ideas around Malmaison. So there's an idea that the Jacobins would mount an ambush with 30 men and seize Napoleon's coach as he went between Malmaison and Paris. Others that they would set fire to some houses to distract Napoleon's guard and then seize him. So there's a lot around that. So the idea that snuff was poisoned, I think that's entirely possible, but it's not greatly sourced, and we don't really have more evidence than what the valet said.
All right, we'll give it another half of an attempt then. We'll put that as a possibility.
We'll chalk that up as potential.
Okay. Now, this one seems like it was more feasible. In October 1800, there was a discovered plot to stab Napoleon to death while he attended the opera in Paris. Can you give us the details on that one?
This is a great one. So again, it involves the opera, much as the bombing attempt a little later would also involve the opera. So yeah, after Napoleon's victory at Marengo, when he comes back to Paris in triumph, you get an upsurge in the number of plots and rumors of plots. And, this is because Napoleon's consolidated his position. So everyone gets a little bit more radicalized, a little bit more desperate. But there's also an element that gets introduced into this particular plot, that those people around Napoleon, particularly those in the police, are fabricating threats to make themselves appear to have good intelligence, or to make themselves look busy or efficient. And in fact, this plot from October 1800, the so-called Affair of the Daggers, looks to me like it's a case of police entrapment, where they introduce an agent provocateur into a group of people who then invent this scheme that they'll go and assassinate Napoleon at the opera. And basically, this agent provocateur is a man called Jacques Harel, who works for the police. And he identifies a group of discontent and disgruntled Corsican and Italian revolutionaries in some cafes in Paris. And he works them up into this state of agitation against Napoleon, saying he's betrayed the revolution. And all these people are unemployed. They're in exile from Italy, unsuccessful revolutionaries. And he persuades them, this agent called Harel, to go to the opera. He doesn't actually say what they'll be doing there. But when they get there, they're all seized by the police. And Harel says, these are the guys that I told you about. These are the guys that were plotting to stab Napoleon. But one of the weird things is when they're searched, and we've got very good records about the police interrogations and what happened afterwards, which I mentioned in the book. But no daggers were actually found on the guys that got arrested. So it looks like Harel almost entirely made it up. He got a reward, and Napoleon was able to come down quite heavily against the sort of exiled Jacobins and radicals that were hanging around Paris. The ones involved in the plot were executed. There's about 4 or 5 of them. But he was able to send out into exile or send away from Paris dozens more. So he was able to sort of clear out the stables a bit there.
Yeah.
In quite a dramatic way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know Napoleon always complained about Joseph Fouché and his police force. They only catch fools and lunatics. But let's kind of talk about that. You know, obviously, while on campaign, let's talk about the people that are assigned to protect Napoleon. This is before Secret Service and all that. Obviously, we have the Consular Guard, later the Imperial Guard, who protected Napoleon on campaign. You had Fouché and his police force to keep an eye on illegal activity. And Napoleon had a personal bodyguard in Rustam Raza. Who were all the folks that were assigned to protect Napoleon?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that the Consular Guard and the Imperial Guard have the kind of day-to-day task of ensuring Napoleon's security. And wherever his coach went, he usually had some outriders. So that's cavalry who go ahead of the coach or behind the coach as well, clear the road, make sure it's safe. And Napoleon usually traveled with an officer like Rapp or Lain in the coach with him. So he's got a reliable officer alongside him just in case. As much for company, I think, because even relatively later on in Napoleon's career, he's not hiding himself. He's relatively easy to get to if you want an audience. And he's taking risks. So I think the only thing he does is he doesn't make clear what his plans are going to be for the next few days. And he's constantly in movement. So he's not an impossible target, and he's not particularly well protected. He's certainly not very well protected by the police. So in 1800, the police in France is a very amateur set of people. I mean, Fouché's got a lovely reputation for being the spider in the web, controlling all this fantastic secret police spy network. But I don't think that's particularly fair or true. The police in Paris were relatively few. There were very few professional policemen. There was a sort of secret department, a secret office that would open letters, but they were really quite busy snooping on aristocrats and different agents. There weren't enough of them. There weren't that many police officers in Paris, so police relied on a network of informers and casual agents that they would give money to. It really was not the modern police state. I mean, a lot of people accuse Napoleon of running a police state, but actually it wasn't like that at all. It just didn't exist. And you mentioned the Mameluke Rustam Raza, and it's true, the Mameluke did sleep in front of Napoleon's door, and he had all these lovely scimitars and knives in his belt. But I don't know if you've seen a portrait of Rustam Raza. He's quite a chubby, plump little guy. Doesn't look that handy with a weapon. And I think it's a little bit symbolic. But he's not the ferocious, Egyptian bare knuckle fighter that you would choose
Yeah.
if you wanted proper bodyguard. So I think Napoleon always did take risks. Even on the battlefield, he was taking risks. He was a
Yeah.
little bit casual about security.
Yeah, he was. I know there was an instance where I think he was too far forward, and Marshal Oudinot said, "Look, if you don't get back on the line, I'm going to throw you in an artillery wagon and get you back there." So I know
Yeah.
he was pretty brazen about taking risks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To his credit, I think that's he viewed himself as a soldier, and he's there for much of his career, leading from the front. It wouldn't be a good look to be skulking around in the rear.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the best known assassination plot, and that's the kind of focus of your book, Killing Napoleon. It's the plot of Rue Saint. Is it Nicaise?
Yeah, Nice's, I think it is. Yeah,
Nicaise,
that
okay.
one.
Okay, and yeah, let's. This is the one that probably came closest to getting it.
It came very close, and it's a very dramatic story. So this is often known as the Infernal Machine, and basically what that means is it's a cart bomb. So that's a little wagon gets loaded up with a couple of barrels of gunpowder and some paving slabs. And there was rumor afterwards that the plotters had put some nails and metal fragments in the barrels to make it even more devastating. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but the blast was enormous and caused a lot of damage. So who were the people behind this plot? Well, this one we can certainly pin down on the royalists. So there were plenty of royalists in Paris in 1800. So one of the things Napoleon had done, he'd given an amnesty and allowed the exiled aristocrats to start coming back to France. And a lot of them came back and lived quiet lives. But there was still the sort of radicalized element who were friends of the Comte d'Artois, who were up to no good. But they were still given permission to come to Paris, to live in Paris. It's just that some of them were looking for trouble. So a very small band of them kind of start getting together. And it does look like some of them were receiving salaries from the British and pensions from the British. But I think that's largely because they had been in British service in emigrant regiments or at Quiberon. It's not necessarily the case that they were receiving money for services with cloaks and daggers. So
Right.
we have to sort of set that aside. Their motivation was pretty clear, and I think money or no money, they would have attempted this.
Mm-hmm.
So they get together, and their idea is that they will mount an attempt on Napoleon's life as he travels between his palace of the Tuileries and the opera at Paris, the opera house in Paris, because it's known that Napoleon will attend the opening night of Haydn's opera on Christmas Eve. And there are three key plotters. There's a guy called Limoelan. He's an aristocrat from Brittany, and has served in the sort of emigrant armies. And there's another not so aristocratic guy called Saint-Régent, and he's an expert in gunpowder. He's a naval artillery officer. And they've got a sidekick, kind of groom, someone that pays for everything, gets the food, organizes the logistics. And he's a man called Carbon, and he's an old soldier from the royalist armies in Brittany. And they're the ones that get this gunpowder, put it on a cart, and drag it through the streets and position it where they think Napoleon's coach will pass. They get a 14-year-old girl to hold the bridle of the horse while they load the wagon with a few more stones.
I think
And
that's the most tragic thing, I think.
it's a very tragic thing. And they get another wagon and try and put it across the road a little bit to slow down Napoleon's coach as it comes along. But Napoleon's escort is able to push aside this coach and push aside the cart with the gunpowder. And the coach continues. And unfortunately, Saint-Régent has slightly miscut the fuse, so it burns a little bit too long, and the bomb only goes off after Napoleon's coach has passed and slightly gone around the corner. So Napoleon's coach is slightly damaged, the glass breaks, but it's the street that's more or less brought down, so the roofs collapse. You've got a lot of people killed, you've got a lot of people wounded, and of course this 14-year-old girl is blown to pieces, as is the horse that was pulling the cart. And it's the horse and the bits of the horse that are key to solving the mystery of who did it, because when the police start investigating, they're able to find someone who can identify the horseshoe as belonging to a horse that they sold to Carbon a couple of days before.
Wow.
And at that point, the plotters, they start to get pursued, and the police are really good at finding them and capturing them. But there's a bit of politics, as usual, and Napoleon, when he first recovers, he's very quick to blame the Jacobins, and he manages to seize them, the key Jacobins in Paris, and exile 200 or so of them, send them into exile, blaming them for the plot, and the newspapers go after the Jacobins, whilst at the same time he's telling the police, how are you doing with the royalists? So bit of politics, but the French police do capture 2 of the plotters, and they get guillotined. But the third one, Limoilin, he actually escapes to America. He's actually buried in America. He's near Washington. So he gets off scot-free. But it's a very interesting, dramatic story, and the way that the police pursue the royalist plotters is well documented. So it's pretty clear who was doing it, who was involved, and how they got caught.
Yeah, I think it's interesting though how close how close it was, and how like little things caused it to miss Napoleon's coach. I believe his coachman was drunk, and he was going faster than usual. But then Josephine's was late in leaving because she was arguing with General Rapp about which scarf to wear.
Exactly.
And she was or was it Hortense or Caroline? Somebody was slightly injured in Josephine's coach.
Yeah, so I think there's some debris, and the windows get broken on coaches, but it's really a matter of seconds, and it could all have been very, very different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting story. Well, moving on from that one, one of the in 1803 there's the so-called Pichegru conspiracy, which eventually helps Napoleon get rid of his biggest rival in the military, in General Moreau. Was this one close to succeeding, or was this kind of pie in the sky, not really going to happen?
So this was, again, a very interesting case, which brings together some of the people from the 1800 Infernal Machine, and they're back on the scene. So there's a man called Cadoudal, who's from Brittany, another one of these royalist soldiers of fortune. And he works, he comes over from Britain, and his idea is he's going to ambush Napoleon with 30 men, either kill or seize Napoleon. And Pichegru, who used to be a Republican general, but had plotted with the royalists, been caught, had been sent into exile, is one of those who comes back. It's a rather strange thing to do, and get involved with these people in Paris. And he's arrested. Cadou's also arrested. But Pichegru is found in his prison cell, strangled. And the idea is that Pichegru has hanged himself to spare himself the shame. But there's also an argument often made by those who, let's say, those who don't like Napoleon, that Napoleon had Pichegru strangled. So we don't have any evidence one way or the other, I don't think, to say definitively what happened, but Pichegru died. Now, General Moreau, he was approached by the plotters. I think my understanding is that he didn't want to be involved, but still his name gets mentioned by them, and so he's sort of blackened by association. And obviously that's pretty much the end of his career. And the fact that he was a rival to Napoleon and a talented general probably doesn't help.
Right. And he's exiled basically to America. I mean, it could have been worse for him. So I think he got off somewhat easy. But yeah, he was definitely
Yeah,
implicated in the plot.
yeah, heavily implicated. He goes off to America, but he comes back, and then he serves on the staff of Tsar Alexander in 1813, which absolutely infuriates the French because that obviously is turncoat changing sides. But on the other hand, you can kind of see it from Moreau's point of view.
Yeah. Well, one of the unfortunate aftermaths of that plot is the arrest and execution of the Duc d'Enghien. But he's not in France, right? They have to go across the border to capture him.
That's right. It's again another one of these events that has been used to blacken Napoleon's name. So Duc d'Enghien is a royalist soldier. He'd been quite active in the emigrant armies of France, those armies raised by the Bourbons, often paid by the Allies to fight the revolution. And he was living in the territory of Baden, just across the Rhine. And the French had implicated him a bit in this plot with Pichegru-Cadoudal. And they went across the Rhine, seized him, brought him back to, I think it was Vincennes, the castle. There was a trial, and he was found guilty of bearing arms against France, and he was shot by a firing squad. So I think that's making an example as a warning to others, but it's rather a clumsy one. And what it did was totally infuriated Europe and really shocked a lot of people in Europe, and gave a lot of ammunition to those who said Napoleon was ruling like a dictator, just seizing people and killing them. So,
right.
Yeah, it's a difficult episode.
This episode is brought to you by Etsy.
Oh.
Hear that?
Okay. Thank you.
Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting. Well, not the ones you're hoping for. You want squeals of delight. Happy tears.
How did you?
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah.
Okay, the song needs a bit of work, but anyway, to get those reactions, make sure everyone on your list feels heard with handmade, handpicked, and designed gifts from small shops on Etsy. Gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, cozy style items, vintage pieces, and home decor to celebrate all of your favorite people and their specific kind of special. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
Well, let's move on to Friedrich Staps, who is different from the other nefarious plots because he's just an average guy who seems to have acted alone. But lest we think this plot had no chance of success, something similar happened to French commander Kléber in Cairo, correct?
That's right. So if we think back to 1800, Kléber was the man that replaced Napoleon in Egypt. Napoleon went back to France. Kléber assumes command, and he's walking in the garden of his headquarters when a student called Suleiman from Syria comes up and stabs him. And Kléber dies of his wounds. And it's a real blow to the French army in Egypt. So these things could happen, did happen. Staps is a very interesting case. But again, we don't have a lot of information or evidence about this whole situation. We're relying on the account of General Rapp a little bit here. So I'm not saying that's hearsay, but what does seem to have happened is that Staps, who was a student, very young man, bit of a German nationalist, had sought an audience with Napoleon, and he was carrying a knife. This time they do actually seem to think he was carrying a weapon. And there's this kind of interview between Napoleon and Staps afterwards. And again, we're not entirely sure if it exactly happened like this, but Napoleon asked him, why do you want to do this? And Staps said, it's for Germany, it's for my nation. And Napoleon says, well, you're clearly mad. Staps says no. But Staps then gets sentenced to be executed, and he becomes a sort of German national hero, particularly from 1813, when German nationalism is really on the rise. He's this great example of a martyr. So, yeah, I think it did happen, and the man certainly was shot. But exactly the dialogue between Napoleon and Staps, we don't know if that's necessarily true. One thing people do say is that this attempt on Napoleon in 1809 made Napoleon very aware that he didn't have an heir. So Josephine wasn't producing children with Napoleon. Napoleon was starting to get worried. This attempt on his life made him think about his legacy, and therefore he decided to divorce Josephine. But I think at the same time, we should remember that in those months in 1809, Napoleon had just got his Polish mistress pregnant. And so he knew he could have children. Mm-hmm. So he knew it was Josephine who couldn't. And I think that's probably more important than the Staps case for making Napoleon think it's time I got another wife, and got on and had Napoleon too. So, it's an interesting case, but
the Staps one, but it's part of the Napoleonic legend almost, that Napoleon allegedly offers clemency to him and says, I'll release you if you promise not to attempt assassination on me again. And allegedly Stapp says, no, I'll just try again. And at that point, Napoleon sends him off to the firing squad. But I don't know if that's part of the legend where he's trying to be magnanimous and say, I'm trying to be forgiving.
Yeah. It's very difficult to say. I don't think Napoleon always was magnanimous. And I think this conversation makes him appear like that. So, like you say, it's very good for the legend. But, ultimately, he was taken away and shot. So, we're relying on one account that gets passed into legend. We're not entirely sure if they had a long talk or even if they spoke. So,
okay. Well, after this attempt, were there any others that I'm not aware of? I know he was close to being captured a few times in Russia, but those are during war circumstances. I don't know of any assassination per se.
So there was a couple we can close with. So Napoleon's on Elba. There's a royalist governor sent to Corsica called Brucelard. And he's a very interesting man who also appears in the Infernal Machine plot in 1800. So he's been working on bringing down Napoleon for at least 15 years. And he gets appointed governor of Corsica. And he allegedly, and again, we don't know too much about this, was hiring assassins to go over to Elba to bump Napoleon off. And that's apparently one of the reasons why Napoleon felt that he was unable to remain in Elba much longer, because he wasn't getting much protection. And he was, by appointing this guy governor of Corsica, the Bourbons were sending a very clear message that, we could do this to you any time.
Right.
So it wasn't really encouraging Napoleon to hang around. So that's one. And then I think we can just close with, and I don't think we've got time for it today, and it's enormously controversial, but of course you've got the whole Ben Ouida case that the British poisoned Napoleon in St. Helena using arsenic, and arsenic was found in Napoleon's blood. And that's the ultimate assassination of Napoleon. But I don't think we've got the time for that one. Ben Ouida's written a couple of books. Some people say it's completely made up. Others say that, why would they do that? But that's probably the last plot or scheme that gets talked about.
Yeah, that would, like you say, that would probably require a whole nother episode. Just that one.
So. I think
but yeah, we'll end on that mystery. But I think that was really informative. I recommend you check out Jonathan's book, Killing Napoleon, which you can find on Amazon. You can find out more about some of these, and really insightful stuff. I appreciate it, my friend.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure talking to you. And like I say, it's all cloaks and daggers, but there's some great stories out there.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you for telling us a few of them, and we'll talk soon.
Talk again soon. Thank you.